deep breath. We're going in to statistics that are not going to trend very well for fertility rates in the church. But hold on. This was prophesied. There has been a plan in place the whole time. Trust me, I am very hopeful and feel very inspired about the guidance that we've had by prophets, the way we've grounded this generation in, my generation and generations younger than me, to be prepared to confront the onslaught that is coming at us.
The restoration of the priesthood is just as relevant to you as a woman.
Okay, so if you're with me, we're talking about fertility rates in the United States, in the globe, and in the church, and the decline, but how that decline is going to happen. In this next section, I just want to caveat this, that it's probably going to freak you out a little bit with the declining fertility rates and in the church and in Latter-day Saints. I just want to say, and projections are just when you look at attitudes, but what I will say is, if you are concerned about this, the wrong approach is to suddenly go out and tell young women in the church to have kids. Trust me, as someone who has 4, if someone comes up to me and says, you need to have kids, my immediate reaction is going to be rebel mode. What I would suggest is a much more effective way to approach this. This truly, it is like a situation. The better approach is to share your own experience about how wonderful it was to be a parent. I'm always saying to my husband, we are our best PR. If we want our kids to get married, they need to see happy we are being married. If they want to have kids, they need to see and hear that we're so happy that we were able to have children. And I will share a personal anecdote. My dad, I statistically speaking, growing up in New England, where things are kind of 10 to 15 years ahead of the rest of the trend of the United States, I really should not be, no one would predict that I would end up having kids, being married, happily married with 4 children. And I have, I did delay marriage a little bit. I got married when I was 27. And so all of those things would say, this girl's not going to have many kids. But the reason that I changed my life trajectory and my life course, I was on a very successful career trajectory. The reason I changed was because my dad had always said a Kimball quote, which was, no success can compensate for failure in the home. And then he would always speak so positively about being a parent. He would say, being a parent's the best experience you can ever have in life. Or man, the happiest times of my life were when you kids were little. Just very positive personal experience. And I was chatting with another one of my friends who, I think she came from a very small family in New England with like 2 children, and she has 6. And I asked her once why she has so many kids when she didn't grow up with that culture. And she said, it was my young women's leader. I had a young women's leader who loved family, loved children, and just always talked about, she was honest, but she was also role modeling for me how great family life is. I have to admit that I wince when I hear women in the church who are mothers and have traditional marriages telling their daughters, you don't need to worry about getting married, go travel, go get your degree. Because the reason I wince is because, trust me, that is the line they are hearing everywhere. They're hearing it on Instagram, they're hearing it on TikTok, they're hearing it at school, they're hearing it on every media site, on every television show. The only place that a young woman or a woman nowadays will ever hear, family life's pretty great. It's really not, career's kind of great, but you know what? It's never going to be as great as family. A job will love you, but it will replace you, and your kids will never replace you, and you never want to give up having that. The only place they're going to hear those kinds of things is young women's, and maybe church, and maybe in their home from their mom and dad. And they're going to need that kind of confidence bolstering effects in their own personal lives, so that when they go out in the world and the world is telling them that having children is like a ball and chain and it holds you back, they're going to be able to hold that in contrast to their own life experience and say, my mom was really happy, or my dad really liked being a parent. My young women's leader really loved being married and having children. So that makes me suspicious of what the world is telling me about family life. Okay, deep breath. We're going in to statistics that are not going to trend very well for fertility rates in the church. But hold on. This was prophesied. There has been a plan in place the whole time. Trust me, I am very hopeful and feel very inspired about the guidance that we've had by prophets, the way we've grounded this generation in, my generation and generations younger than me, to be prepared to confront the onslaught that is coming at us. Okay, so basic premise is that these are CDC numbers, and this was done by the Institute of Family Studies. They show there's this general trend that shows that people who are religious have more kids than people who are not religious. And this chart shows that the yellow line, that people who attend church weekly, which I think is a nice metric for religiosity because it's actually behavioral, not just do you identify. It's, do you go to church? Do you attend church weekly? Have a birth rate of above 2 kids, and it varies whether it's 2.5 or 2. It pretty consistently, and that goes. This is measured to 2020. People who are not religious, who don't attend, that's the blue line, have about half, 1 child less to 1.5 children less than religious people. So basic premise is that religious people are more fertile, have more children than non-religious people. Okay. We also have found that conservatives generally have more kids and have them earlier. So this is important. And I don't want to be reductive to this study and say that you can't be a Democrat and vote, and have 10 kids. Like, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that trends show that the way that you identify politically does show a value system, and that value system results in more kids or less kids. And that's every polling or research institute is going to show that same trend, that people who are less religious or liberal have less children, and people who are religious and more conservative have more children. That is the trend. Okay, so this shows that when you delay having kids, or you have them younger, you have more. And you can see that there was, in this dark blue line is is showing like conservative women, and you are seeing like a bit of a nosedive in the 80s and 90s where conservative women are having less children, but they're still having more than liberal women. Liberal women who in different age brackets are always liberal women are always having half to 40% less children than conservatives who are religious. So the more liberal you are, the more non-religious you are, the less children you have. The more conservative you are, the more religious you are, the more children you have. That's genuinely the trend that you see in every kind of organization. So this is called the conservative fertility advantage, and it was written by the Institute for Family Studies in 2020. So it's a little outdated, and I had read somewhere that there was I want to say it was 1 in 4 to 1 in 4, that for every 1 to 4, that for every like liberal baby born, there are 4 conservative children born, and that was a few years ago. So I would imagine it's more like 1 in 5 now. But this article talks about that gap, the conservative fertility advantage, that conservatives are replacing themselves and adding to their population, and liberals and once again, this isn't like you can't be Democrat and have children. It's that when you assign yourself to a political worldview, you've chosen a worldview, and that worldview does result in certain predictable behaviors, and people who identify with a more liberal worldview tend to have less children. And so it's great because it shows when people identify a certain way, we can predict how they're going to behave. Okay, Pew Research Institute, who I love, they're not a religious organization, but they do great research, did a poll in the United States asking, like, there's definitely declining fertility and family size and population growth. What do you think of that? So what do Americans think of fewer people choosing children? And the graph I want you to see shows that between Republicans and Democrats, Republicans think it's not good to have less children in America, whereas Democrats overwhelmingly say, at a much higher percentage anyway, they say that Americans choosing to have kids would impact the U.S. They agree with that at much higher rates. So very different views on declining fertility. This is a guy who does some interesting statistical studies on religious groups in the United States. His name is Ryan Berg. I don't like his stats that show stuff about Muslims in America because it makes them look like they're this huge growing population when they're huge. They're 1%. They're literally 1.3% of the population. Like there are Muslims in America, a very tiny, tiny, tiny cohort. And so yes, they are growing, but they also are small and they haven't hit that modernization hit where whether you're Indian or Hindu or Asian or whatever kind of Arab, you come to the United States and you modernize, you become a little more secular, and you immediately have a decreased family size population within a couple of generations. So I would caveat some of his research on that front. But he says his basic conclusions recently are, and this was 2023 research, he said that young Mormons are abandoning the GOP. Once again, I'm trying not to make this political. I'm trying to say that political views reflect your value systems, and those value systems have behaviors that correlate. And so when you see in these studies that he's showing that the younger generations of Latter-day Saint kids are more liberal, you can project that younger generations, so he found a 12-point gap that between like the boomer generation who identify as 20% Democrat, the generation that are younger than 20 years old are almost 40% Democrat. It's almost double. That's almost double the number of kids who are going to be identifying more with liberal views, and liberal views are more correlated with delaying marriage, birth control, limiting family size, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's also something even he admits that it's a sample size issue, but I don't know. I think you can see some real conditions with like liberalism, like younger generations just being more liberal. This is something to be said about mental health acumen of liberal women. And this is the reason I think this is interesting. It's kind of a chicken or the egg situation where a lot of women will report one of the reasons that they don't want kids is because of mental health issues. And it's interesting that when you look at self-reported mental health issues and then you categorize them by, and this is the Pew Research Institute, and then you categorize them by political leanings, liberal women have really high rates of mental health, self-reported mental health issues between every age group. It does tend to peter out by like 50 plus, quite a bit actually. It's still a lot higher than conservatives at the same ages. So I don't know. It's interesting to kind of look at that. Okay. This is a Washington Post article that they've accumulated, and I know people will pull up graphs that will say, oh, the LDS birth rate is really high compared to the national average, but what they're not doing is they're not isolating for the boomer generation, which is what this graph up here on the right highlighted in orange does, and it does show that boomers had much larger proportion of them had like bigger families, and this younger generation is having smaller families, much more common for us to have 1 to 2 children than 3 to 4, and much less proportion of like families with 5 or 6 kids or 7 or more kids. Actually, it's interesting how the same between the boomers, Gen X, and millennials, you basically have the same percentage, 15 to 12% of our group of our membership have 7 or more children. That hasn't changed much. And then between the boomers and Gen X, there's about 25% of us that have family sizes of 5 or 6. It does drop down a little bit with millennials to 18%. Now, I am a millennial, so I can say that I do think those numbers are probably pretty fixed. I know people are having kids into their 40s, but there's not that many. Like if you already have 4 or 5 kids, you probably aren't going to have that I would say that that number seems pretty solid. And then where you really see a big gap is there are more millennials having 38% of them are having 3 to 4 kids, and versus 33%. So interesting. It says yeah, interesting. All right. So this is kind of a decline, Mormon decline. Now it's not a steep decline. It's like it's like half a kid between 2008 and 2022. But what is concerning is that when you look at other indicators, it seems like that trajectory is going to continue, and that indicates like a kind of a cultural change in our perception of children as a group of people. And this shows Mormon political affiliation from like year to year, and you can definitely see a declining number of people associating with the Republican Party, a lot more independents. So it used to be, maybe we'll say like the 60s used to be like 10% were independents, and now 20% more independents. And then in the 50s and 60s, it was like 20% of people were Democrats, and now 33%. This was the 90s. So I bet it's more than that now. 33%, 30 to 40% of people in the church identify as liberal. So I think it's clear that liberals are members of the church becoming more liberal. So this is a trend that I think is most interesting to me, is who is becoming liberal in the church. And I think you can make a very clear argument that it's actually not everyone that is becoming more liberal. It's actually more women disproportionately are becoming more liberal. Okay. And what they're finding is that among young adults, it's women, young women in the Gen Z generation are leaving religion at a much higher proportion. They're becoming more agnostic and walking away from organized religion at much higher rates, a rate of 54 to 46%, more than boys, more than young men. And that the same trend, and that's different for millennials. So that's an interesting trend to see. And the same thing is true. This is from let's see what the source is on this one. This is from Gallup poll, very credible. It's showing this crazy widening gap politically between young men and young women between the ages of 18 and 29. And they're finding that young women, especially in the last 10 years, 15 years, are becoming way more political. Like it's just leaped since about 2010. You've seen really intense spikes towards liberalism, and young men have basically stayed about the same. And so that's interesting, because why I think that's interesting is because, in the 90s, political differences were kind of like how you want to spend the deficit, or economic differences. More so than ever, the political ideologies actually do address social values and family values. So, the abortion issue, or, that comes to mind first because it's kind of like a major part of the liberal platform. But at the end of the day, what you can, and these are, just so you know, these are women in general in America, not LDS women. This is just every women in the United States. And they're overwhelmingly becoming, even to the age of 30, they're overwhelmingly becoming more liberal. And that is reflection. Liberal, we've said earlier, like conservative, the more conservative and more traditional and religious you are, the bigger families you have, the more liberal and a-religious you are, the lower your fertility rate, if at all. So, what I'm also starting to see in the in the LDS community, which isn't surprising, is the influx of secular Mormonism, meaning like you're culturally identifying as Latter-day Saint, but you aren't actually like imbibing the practices. And you're also seeing an increased celebration of singleness, for lack of a better term. This is a new Faith Matters podcast called The Soloist. And it's, quote, "We discuss how important it is to move beyond the idea that marriage is the only path to fulfillment and how embracing singleness can lead to profound spiritual growth." So this is interesting. I think the vocabulary on this is really interesting. Just the wording that's used to promote this podcast and this conversation. These women share their deep personal stories about what it's like to navigate a church community where singleness sometimes feels like a problem to be solved rather than a valid, whole way of being. So I mentioned earlier that celebration of singleness is a feature of a culture with declining fertility rates. There's one, there's the first factor, which is it feasible to be a single woman financially? Can you actually provide a daily living for yourself? That's the first phase. But then the second phase is it socially acceptable to be single? And in my generation, you had Sex and the City, which introduced this, it really tackled the phenomenon of, it basically beat down the stigma of being single as a valid way of being and made it socially acceptable to be single and thriving. And as a result, expect more women to get on that bandwagon, because honestly, why would you? So this is I don't know, celebrating singleness. I don't think that we should ever criticize people who are single ever, but to celebrate singleness as a lifestyle path is kind of runs contrary to our core beliefs, which is that we're striving to grow to become like Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother, which means making decisions like prioritizing getting married at different ages. Again, I got married when I was 27, 28, and having children. So the problem with, I think, some of the language about this podcast, as I've listened to, is that they treat singleness like a fixed state, like it's, being single is like, it's not a fixed state. It's like, you're not, it's like the mommy wars, being a working mom, single moms. Like, you know what? Those are things that change. You can change that situation. You may be single, you may be married, you know what I mean? Those are very changeable identities. And so if you're going to plant your flag and fix your identity as someone who is single and proud, you are kind of closing the door to an openness towards getting married, or even setting a goal towards getting married. And more so now, like, I think the vocabulary of the 60s and 70s was that, oh, if every woman has an opportunity to get married, but that's because there were so many more women in the church, and there aren't anymore. There aren't, it's not this dwarfing number of women in the church. It's actually kind of evening out. And so when you have a group of women, and I feel like we should reference that magazine article that I showed you at the beginning of women, this Asian woman walking away from the man holding a flower who's looking downtrodden. Like, women are walking away from marriage in a lot of these societies with declining fertility rates. We are going to have women who are LDS walking away from marriage. And this is what the vocabulary looks like. It looks like, let's, see singleness as a valid whole way of being. And I would challenge the fixed mindset approach to being single. I think everyone's involved. Everyone's going to be able to contribute. There is a better way, though. And if you haven't been married because you haven't had the opportunity, that's one thing. But if you aren't married because you keep saying no to the opportunity, that's something else that you have chosen. So, Elder Bednar kind of has this prophetic quote where he says, in the phrase, "in the path of their duty," describes faithful married men and women who honor their covenant responsibility to multiply and replenish the earth, and who are blessed with the strength and stamina to wrestle with their children in sacrament meetings. In an increasingly confused world beset by calamities and misplaced priorities, these courageous souls heed not the secular voices extolling self-centeredness. They reverence the sanctity and importance of life and Heavenly Father's plan of happiness for his children. So an interesting thing he said in this quote, which I think is going to be appreciated in the future more, is that it says, he describes them as brave and courageous, specifically courageous, because they will continue to have children when the world is beset by calamities. And one of the number one reasons that younger people who have decided they don't want kids, or who don't necessarily want to be mothers, they cite climate change is the number one reason that they don't want to have kids in the future. So that's an interesting point. And also remember what happened to fertility rates when COVID happened. Everyone expected there to be a baby boom because everybody was home, but it wasn't. It was actually a baby collapse. People were calling it the baby bust. And so it's interesting that as the last days have been, we expect the last days, or the premillennial gathering, to get worse. We expect it to get more kind of unpredictable. And so people who continue to have children and raise children will do so deliberately. They will do so because they feel the path of their duty is to honor their covenants, to bring children into this world. And I do think that there will be special inspiration for covenant men and women I think there will be extra measures of courage given to them if they feel inspired to have more kids during such a time as this. But it will be a choice. And that's what Elder Bednar is saying here, is that in the last days, the choices to not be in a family will be so abundant that the people who actually choose to get married and actually choose to have children will be very, very rare. This is the current trajectory in the United States of different ethnic groups and their fertility rates, plus how many kids they're having. And you can see where the blue line, we go up and then we go way down. And we are still doing better than most. We are tied with the Muslims. But once again, I don't like his stats on, this guy is Ryan Berg. I don't like his stats on Muslims in the United States, is because they're not a big group of people. They are literally 1.3% of the American population. So they're a tiny group. Okay. So this is what I actually expect and predict is going to happen in the future for the LDS community. And it's what I've seen happen in the Jewish community. What is going to happen is that we've just looked at a bunch of large generalized averages. We've looked at a few generalized trends. We've seen that liberalism is becoming more common. Well, first of all, we've seen that religious conservatism on one end is an indication of behaviors that is going to have more children. Less religious liberalism is an indication that people are going to have less children. They get married later. They have a lot of birth control. Just getting married later is the biggest indication of limiting fertility, because your fertility window is lower. But we've seen this play out in several different traditional religions. I had mentioned to you before, in Islam, they refer to the Jews and the Christians as Ahl al-Kitab, which is the people of the book, meaning the people who believe in the Bible, who believe in Genesis, Exodus, and revere Father Abraham as a very important father, right? We can see in here in the middle of this little Venn diagram that God of Abraham is one of the most uniting, and covenant with Moses is one of the most uniting aspects of, well, not uniting, but shared aspects of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And so they share this real loyalty to the Abrahamic covenant. And I know we think we're super special because we believe in the Abrahamic covenant, but there's an argument to be made, but these are the other groups of people who still are striving to live it. I think you can argue. Now, my husband and I have worked in the Middle East and studied in the Middle East for years. And what's amazing to me is when you go to Israel, it actually seems kind of secular. And it's kind of surprising how, for a very traditional community, they've very much modernized, and they've experienced a lot of secularization in their community. But when you look at the averages of the fertility rate of Israel, they have one of the best fertility rates in the world. They're at 3 kids on average per family, but that isn't necessarily showing the whole picture. In the they're much better than the United States, South Korea, which is on like, most Asian countries are on like a nosedive down, a concerning slope downward. They literally cannot pay their women enough to have children. There's just, look, like, it's literally, South Korea is like negative 0.05. In fact, there's these dark jokes made that like North Korea doesn't have to invade South Korea in 10 years. They're just going to walk in there because there won't be any young people left. There won't be any young people. They're just literally not having children. So this makes it look like everyone in Israel must be having 4 or 5 kids. But that's not the case. In fact, what's happening in Israel, which I think is going to happen to us, is that you have several different sects of Jews in the state of Israel. You also have Muslims, but you have religious Jews, which is ironic because there is such a thing as a secular Jew. And the reason I like this is because when you see these kind of pop culture Bravo TV shows like Real Mormon Housewives and Bad Mormon and all these shows that are promoting women who are Mormon, but they're not behaving like it, that's what you call secular Mormonism. They are cultural Mormons, right? They were raised Mormon, they were born in the culture, but they don't really practice anymore. What you're going to see is a bifurcation or a separation of different types of Mormons. You're going to see religious Mormons, and then you're going to see more secularizing happening in our church, in that people will be members of the church, but they will behave more secular, and they will you're going to see birth rates happen like this. You're going to see more secular people producing less. You're going to see more religious people, like the Haredi Jews, have a birth rate of 7 on average per couple. That's so high. That is so high. And religious Jews are having about 4 kids. So what you're finding is that even though a large proportion of the Israeli country has become very like secular and modern, and they're not having many kids, this small minority group of very religious Jews are having all of the kids. This is a picture that I really liked of Haredi Jews practicing a religious, rite of sorts. Okay, in 2015, they were 8% of the population. They were not that big, okay? You've got the secular Jews in 2015 were 40% of the population. And then you've got kind of moderate Jews were another 20%. So the secular and moderately traditional Jews in 2015 made up a majority of the country. But what has happened is that the secular and moderates stopped really the seculars basically have like 1 to 2 kids, if anything. The moderates have 3 or 4. And what you're finding is, this is an amazing graph. It shows that since 2015, they are showing that by 2050, so I mean, that's a ways away, but they're basically showing at the fertility rate of this tiny minority group is going to allow the Haredi Jews to become a majority of the next generation of the population of Israel. And they're going to, and unsurprisingly, the more secular Jews are going to become a much smaller proportion of the population. This is crazy. The Haredi Jews of Israel have 7 kids on average, and then secular Jews have 2 kids on average. I mean, I actually think it's lower than that based on kind of what I've observed and seen. I think what keeps them afloat as well is the fact that Jews still really, really care about marrying each other. They really do care about keeping their religious traditions alive through marriage. So I came to the point that I was making before about how you're going to see our culture look like this. This is my prediction, is that where you see this division between really traditional Jews who are kind of living versions that they think of the covenant. And there's a lot of problems with the Haredi Jews. I know that. I know that they are problematic in some ways. And then secular Jews are going to basically have 1 to 2 kids. I think you're going to see a very similar pattern happen in the LDS community. And the reason I think we need to be prepared for it is so that we can make a choice who we want to be. And I'm not going to say that being traditional means you have to have X number of kids and being, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the principle is a love of children, a desire to be like Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother, a desire to honor the covenant. Okay, so this was a story that Elder Bednar told about Elder Holland. He said, while I was serving as the president of Brigham Young University, Idaho, Elder Jeffrey R. Holland came to campus in December 1998 to speak in one of our weekly devotionals. Susan and I invited a group of students to meet and visit with Elder Holland before he delivered his message. As our time together was drawing to a close, I asked Elder Holland if he could teach these students just one thing. What would it be? He answered, we are witnessing an ever greater movement toward polarity. The middle ground options will be removed from us as Latter-day Saints. The middle of the road will be withdrawn. If you are treading water in the current of a river, you will go somewhere. You simply will go wherever the current takes you. Going with the stream, following the tide, drifting in the current will not do. Choices have to be made. Not making a choice is a choice. Learn to choose now. Elder Holland's statement about increasing polarization has been proven prophetic by the societal trends and events of the 22 years since he answered my question. Foretelling the widening divergence between the ways of the Lord and the ways of the world, Elder Holland warned that the days of comfortably having one foot in the restored church and one foot in the world were vanishing quickly. The servant of the Lord was encouraging the people to choose, prepare, and become devoted disciples of the Savior, and he was helping them to prepare and press forward to and through proving, examining, and trying experiences of their lives. I think he was not talking about fertility, but I think when you look at the Jews in the United States, it's so interesting to me that there is 30%, almost 30% of the Jewish population of the United States identifies as secular, meaning they identify as culturally Jewish, but not religious. That's crazy. And that gap has widened in the generations, the younger the generations go. So in Jewish people in America who are 65 years and older, 85% of them identify as being religious. But when you go down to the 18 to 30-year-olds, only 60% of American Jews identify as being religious. You are going to see a growing secularization in the LDS church. You're going to see people who are culturally Mormon, or they grew up Mormon, or they have pioneer ancestry, who basically are secular. And the reason we need to be prepared for this is so that our feelings aren't hurt, or we're not caught off guard when our friends kind of go that direction. And we also need to be prepared to bolster the confidence of the younger generation, filling them with confidence to go forward and be inspired to have children, and be inspired to get married, and know that it's a really exciting, wonderful path. The final interesting thing that is interesting here that I wanted to leave you with in a couple articles in The Economist, which I think speaks to this reality that we have a total transformation of our core values as a society. Your core values are the things that deeply motivate you in everything that you do. And what they're finding in a lot of these societies with declining birth rates, particularly in Europe, is that the core values of children have actually completely shifted, and that the core value for posterity no longer exists. And there's, in The Economist, they actually found that incentives trying to pay women to have children, basically you don't pay taxes if you have kids before the age of 25. You just no taxes forever, tax free. And this article in The Economist says that policies to boost birth rates just don't work. They've been trying to do it for 15 years, and it's just not working. This gentleman, who wrote Population, Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline, has a very ominous interview that I at some point might watch with you guys, in which he says this very foreboding quote. He says this it was alarming to me because it felt so on the nose. He said, these incentives don't work, not because government's let's come in and offset these prices, the costs of having children. He's they're not having children They're not having children because it costs so much. They're not having children because they just don't want them. That's a quote that he says. He says, for some reason, this generation does not value participating in the creation of the next generation. And so I wanted to let that sink in, that quote, where once again, we believe in a core value, in our religion, in creating the next generation, in protecting our posterity. And I think that there's something very prophetic and inspired about the temple time that we spend there, when you look at the way that this core value, this one core value of children, is completely disappearing from European countries and from certain subsets of the American culture. Like in New England, this value system has already taken place. There is no value system of youth there participating in the creation of the next generation. But the Abrahamic covenant is a value system for us, a core value of valuing family, valuing marriage, and valuing children. So this is just kind of laying bare the fertility and population trajectory of our culture, the way that I really predict it'll go, and the way it's going to manifest itself in our wards and our communities. I am going to do some follow-up videos though, because I'm not discouraged. I actually feel like this is what we've been prepared for. For 30, 40 years, the Young Women's Program has been marinating young women and women in a value of motherhood, in a value of womanhood, and has been teaching men that the greatest achievement that they can have is becoming fathers. And I don't think it's a mistake. I don't think it's an accident that we have started talking about the partnership between Heavenly Mother and Heavenly Father more and more. Coming back to that point that I made when I started about the Magic Eye book, be grateful for the contrast, because the more that we can see the world separating itself from the divine family format, the more the value of modeling our lives after Heavenly Mother and Heavenly Father and Adam and Eve becomes necessary, because there are cultures who have completely lost the core value of having children, of creating and participating in the creation of the next generation. President Kimball has a very eerie quote where he says, if the world loses the moral rectitude of its women, the world will never recover. And I feel like that's a riddle. I'm like, what is something that once you lose, you can never recover? And the answer is bloodlines. Once women walk away from being mothers and decide that they don't want children, or for lack of planning, they say, I'm just going to put off motherhood and marriage until my 40s, and then they're surprised they can't find someone to marry or they can't get pregnant, those bloodlines will never be picked up again. And I wonder sometimes when they saw Isaiah, did God just show Isaiah a picture of our family trees? Did he just say, this is what the family trees of the last generation will look like? And he looked at these family trees and saw this disappearance of children and this disappearance of men and women getting married. And he probably thought there must be some apocalypse happening. Little did he know, this will all be because of choice. This will all be as a result of actionable choices that people made based on their core values of family or the Abrahamic covenant. So that's this very long-winded presentation, but I think it should give you guys something to think about. And in the future, I'm going to talk a lot about the ways that we've been prepared to remain a covenant Abrahamic people. I have such a testimony of the priesthood restoration. I do believe that the priesthood was restored, and I do believe that we are being taught, as women especially, so much about priesthood restoration and power so that we can make it through this last battle. We are in a premillennial gathering, but we're not there yet, and we need to be able to make it through this last battle, which is retaining a core value of children and families and marriage. And I think the blessings of being covenant keepers will help us get through it. So like and subscribe. I hope you'll leave a comment below, and I hope you'll stick with me. I mean, you guys have been so great so far. If you want to message me questions you want me to cover on the comment section or in my email below, I have a long, exciting list of topics, but I'm excited to respond. I had a few emails about Heavenly Mother, so I'll definitely be doing some follow-up videos on that. But otherwise, thanks for listening. Bye.
The restoration of the priesthood is just as relevant to you as a woman